Sergeant Michael Thompson stood in the rain outside the military headquarters, clutching his deployment orders with trembling hands. The water droplets mixed with the tears he refused to acknowledge as they rolled down his weathered cheeks. 25 years of dedicated service to the British Army, and this is how it would end. The notification was cold and clinical, just like everything else about this place lately. The letter informed him that his Victoria Cross recommendation had been downgraded to a simple commendation. The same award that should have recognized his extraordinary courage in Afghanistan, where he single-handedly rescued 12 wounded soldiers from a burning convoy while under heavy enemy fire, was now reduced to a piece of paper that would gather dust in some filing cabinet. Michael remembered that day in Helmand Province like it was yesterday. The roadside bomb had flipped their armored vehicle, trapping his comrades inside as flames began to engulf the metal shell. Without hesitation, he had charged back into the inferno 3 times, each trip more dangerous than the last, pulling out unconscious soldiers while bullets whistled past his ears. The smoke was so thick he could barely see, and the heat was so intense it melted parts of his gear. His commanding officer, Colonel Williams, had promised him that his actions would receive the highest recognition. The initial paperwork clearly stated Victoria Cross, the most prestigious military honor for valor in the face of the enemy. Michael had never sought glory or medals, but his fellow soldiers deserved to know that their lives mattered enough for such recognition. But somewhere between the battlefield and the bureaucratic maze of military administration, things had changed. New staff members had taken over the awards department, people who had never heard the screaming of wounded men or felt the heat of enemy fire on their faces. They looked at paperwork, not heroism. They saw statistics, not sacrifice. The worst part was the way they delivered the news. A junior clerk, barely out of training, had called him into a sterile office and read from a prepared statement. No explanation, no apology, just a matter-of-fact announcement that his case had been reviewed and found insufficient for the Victoria Cross. The young man couldn't even look Michael in the eyes while speaking. Michael's wife Sarah had been devastated when he told her. She had been planning to attend the ceremony at Buckingham Palace, had even bought a new dress for the occasion. Their children had been telling their friends at school about their hero father. Now he had to explain to his 8-year-old daughter why Daddy wouldn't be meeting the Queen after all. The rain continued to fall as Michael walked slowly toward the car park, his military boots splashing through puddles that reflected the gray sky above. He thought about all the young soldiers he had trained over the years, how he had always told them that courage and sacrifice would be rewarded, that the military took care of its own. Now those words felt hollow and meaningless. His phone buzzed with messages from fellow veterans who had heard the news. The military community was tight-knit, and word traveled fast when one of their own was treated unfairly. Messages of support poured in, but they couldn't heal the wound that had been opened by this betrayal. Some suggested he appeal the decision, others recommended going to the media, but Michael felt too exhausted to fight anymore. As he reached his car, Michael paused and looked back at the imposing building that housed the military administration. Somewhere inside those walls, people who had never risked their lives for others were making decisions about who deserved recognition for bravery. The irony was not lost on him that the same institution he had served faithfully was now the source of his deepest disappointment. He drove home in silence, the radio turned off and his thoughts consumed by memories of that day in Afghanistan. The faces of the soldiers he had saved flashed before his eyes, and he wondered if they knew what had happened to his award. Would they think less of his actions now that some bureaucrat had deemed them unworthy of the highest honor? That evening, as Michael sat in his modest living room surrounded by photographs of his military career, he made a decision. He would not let this defeat define him or diminish the importance of what he had done. The Victoria Cross was just a medal, but the lives he had saved were real, and no administrative decision could change that fact. Little did Michael know that his story was far from over, and that sometimes the most unexpected interventions come from the most unlikely sources. The wheels of justice move slowly in bureaucratic institutions, but occasionally, they move in ways that no one could have predicted. 3 weeks had passed since the devastating news about Michael's downgraded award, and life had settled into a routine of quiet disappointment. His wife Sarah continued her job as a primary school teacher, but colleagues noticed she seemed distracted and less cheerful than usual. The children, Tommy and Emma, had stopped asking about the palace ceremony, sensing their parents' sadness even though they couldn't fully understand what had happened. Michael had taken extended leave from his position at the training depot, unable to face the daily reminders of a military system that had let him down. He spent his mornings walking their dog, Rex, through the countryside near their home in Wiltshire, trying to find peace in the rolling hills and ancient stone walls that dotted the landscape. It was during one of these walks that Michael encountered Walter Henley, an elderly gentleman who lived in the cottage at the end of the lane. Walter was tending to his garden, carefully pruning rose bushes that had been planted decades earlier. The old man looked up as Michael approached, his weathered face creasing into a gentle smile. Walter had served in the Royal Navy during the Korean War and recognized something familiar in Michael's bearing. Military men, he knew, carried themselves differently, even years after leaving service. But he also noticed something else in Michael's eyes, a sadness that seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders. Their first conversation was brief and polite, just neighbors exchanging pleasantries about the weather and the beauty of the countryside. But Walter was perceptive, and he sensed that this younger man was carrying a burden that went beyond the ordinary stresses of daily life. He invited Michael in for tea, an offer that was politely declined but appreciated nonetheless. Over the following days, their encounters became more frequent and gradually more personal. Walter had a gift for listening without judgment, and slowly Michael began to share pieces of his story. He spoke about Afghanistan, about the friends he had lost, and eventually about the recent disappointment with his award. Walter listened with the patience that comes with age and experience. He had seen enough of military bureaucracy during his own service to understand how good men could be overlooked or undervalued by systems that prioritize paperwork over people. When Michael finished his account, Walter simply nodded and offered to refill his teacup. What Michael didn't know was that Walter Henley was not just a retired sailor with a green thumb. In his younger days, he had served as an aide to several high-ranking naval officers, and even in retirement, he maintained connections with people who moved in influential circles. Walter understood that sometimes the most effective way to address injustice was through quiet, behind-the-scenes advocacy rather than public confrontation. That evening, Walter made several phone calls to old friends and former colleagues. He spoke carefully and diplomatically, never mentioning names or specific details, but painting a picture of a decorated soldier who had been treated unfairly by an administrative system that had lost sight of its core values. His contacts listened with interest, some taking notes, others promising to make inquiries of their own. Within days, Walter's network had begun to spread the story through the informal channels that exist within the British military establishment. These were not official communications, but rather the kind of conversations that happen over drinks at officers' clubs and during chance encounters at military events. The story of the downgraded Victoria Cross began to circulate among people who had the power to investigate and potentially correct such oversights. Michael remained unaware of Walter's quiet campaign on his behalf. He continued his walks with Rex, gradually finding some measure of peace in the routine of rural life. Sarah noticed that he seemed slightly less troubled, though she attributed this to the therapeutic effect of time and countryside air, rather than any external intervention. At the military headquarters where Michael's case had been decided, however, things were beginning to stir. Senior officers who had been contacted by Walter's network began making discreet inquiries about recent award decisions. The staff members responsible for downgrading Michael's recommendation found themselves fielding unexpected questions from superiors they rarely interacted with directly. The bureaucrats who had made the decision were confident in their actions. They had followed proper procedures and applied standard criteria when reviewing the case. But as more senior officers began asking questions, some began to wonder if they had been too hasty in their assessment. The case file was retrieved and reviewed again, this time by people with actual combat experience. Meanwhile, Walter continued his careful orchestration from his cottage garden. He made additional calls, sent thoughtful letters, and even arranged a few strategic meetings between people who might not otherwise have crossed paths. His approach was subtle but persistent, like water gradually wearing away stone through patient application of pressure. As the second month since Michael's disappointment drew to a close, the first signs of change began to emerge. A senior officer at headquarters requested a complete review of all recent award decisions, citing concerns about consistency and fairness in the evaluation process. The directive was carefully worded to avoid suggesting any specific wrongdoing, but its implications were clear to those who understood military politics. Michael continued his daily walks, unaware that forces were aligning in his favor through the patient work of an elderly neighbor who understood that sometimes justice requires a gentle but persistent nudge from unexpected quarters. The review process that Walter's network had quietly initiated was now gaining momentum within the military establishment. Major General Patricia Hayes, a respected officer with 30 years of experience, had been tasked with examining recent award decisions as part of what was officially described as a routine quality assurance audit. General Hayes was known throughout the military for her unwavering commitment to fairness and her intolerance for bureaucratic shortcuts. She had served in Iraq and Afghanistan herself, leading troops in some of the most dangerous operations of both conflicts. When she read Michael Thompson's case file for the first time, she immediately recognized that something was seriously wrong. The original field reports painted a vivid picture of extraordinary heroism under fire. Michael's commanding officer, Colonel Williams, had provided detailed testimony about the rescue operation, supported by statements from multiple witnesses and even helmet camera footage that documented parts of the action. The medical report showed that several of the rescued soldiers would have died without immediate evacuation from the burning vehicle. Yet somehow, this overwhelming evidence of exceptional valor had been reduced to a simple commendation by staff officers who had never seen combat. General Hayes discovered that the decision had been made by a committee of 3 administrators, none of whom had military field experience beyond basic training exercises. The reasons given for the downgrade were technical and bureaucratic in nature. The committee had questioned whether Michael's actions exceeded the normal expectations of duty, whether sufficient enemy contact had been documented, and whether the rescue could be classified as extraordinary rather than simply competent. These were the kinds of questions asked by people who viewed military service through spreadsheets, rather than through the eyes of soldiers under fire. General Hayes requested access to the helmet camera, footage and witness statements that had been filed with the original recommendation. As she watched the grainy video of Michael charging repeatedly into the smoke-filled wreckage while explosions erupted around him, she felt a growing anger at the bureaucratic blindness that had led to this injustice. She also discovered something else troubling. The committee that had downgraded Michael's award had processed an unusually high number of similar downgrades in recent months. Victoria Cross recommendations were being systematically reduced to lower awards, apparently as part of an unofficial policy to limit the number of highest honors granted. This was not formal military doctrine, but rather the result of budget concerns and administrative convenience. The more General Hayes investigated, the more she realized that Michael's case was not isolated. Other deserving soldiers had been denied appropriate recognition for their service, victims of a system that had prioritized cost-cutting over honoring genuine heroism. This discovery transformed what had begun as a routine review into something much more significant. Meanwhile, Michael's daily life had settled into a pattern of quiet routine. His walks with Rex had become longer and more contemplative, often taking him through the historic villages that dotted the Wiltshire countryside. He found comfort in the ancient churches and stone cottages that had witnessed centuries of human struggle and triumph, reminding him that his own disappointment was just one small chapter in a much larger story. Sarah had noticed positive changes in her husband's mood over recent weeks. The crushing depression that had followed his award downgrade was gradually lifting, replaced by a calmer acceptance of circumstances beyond his control. She encouraged him to consider returning to active duty. But Michael wasn't ready to face the military environment that had disappointed him so deeply. Their children, Tommy and Emma, had adapted to their father's extended presence at home, with the resilience that comes naturally to young people. Tommy, now 9 years old, had begun joining Michael on some of his shorter walks, asking questions about the countryside and listening to stories about military life that carefully avoided the more difficult realities of combat. Walter Henley continued his subtle advocacy campaign, though he never mentioned his efforts to Michael during their increasingly frequent conversations over tea. The elderly veteran had learned through his network that General Hayes was conducting a thorough review, but he was careful not to reveal any specifics that might compromise the investigation or raise false hopes. Instead, Walter focused on providing Michael with the kind of friendship and support that helped heal the deeper wounds caused by institutional betrayal. Their conversations ranged widely, from gardening techniques to military history, from local folklore to practical philosophy. Walter had a gift for helping Michael see his situation within a broader context of service and sacrifice that transcended any single award or recognition. As autumn deepened into winter, General Hayes completed her preliminary investigation and began preparing her recommendations for senior leadership. Her findings were damning for the administrative staff who had made the downgrade decisions, but they also pointed toward systemic problems that would require significant changes in how military awards were processed and evaluated. The general knew that her report would create controversy within the military establishment. Overturning award decisions was extremely rare and would embarrass the officers who had made the original downgrades. But she also knew that allowing such injustices to stand would damage the military's credibility and undermine the trust that soldiers placed in their institutions. Her report was carefully crafted to focus on procedural failures rather than individual blame, but its conclusions were unambiguous. Michael Thompson's Victoria Cross recommendation should be restored, along with several other cases that had been inappropriately downgraded. The administrative committee responsible for these decisions should be disbanded and replaced with a panel that included officers with actual combat experience. As winter settled over the Wiltshire countryside, Michael continued his daily walks, unaware that his case was about to become the centerpiece of a major reform within the military award system. The seeds that Walter had planted through his quiet diplomacy were finally beginning to bear fruit, though the most dramatic developments were yet to come. General Hayes submitted her comprehensive report to the Chief of the General Staff on a cold February morning. The document was classified and marked for immediate attention, containing not only her findings about Michael's case, but also recommendations for sweeping reforms to the entire military award system. She had spent weeks crafting language that was both diplomatically acceptable and uncompromisingly clear about the injustices that had occurred. Within hours of receiving the report, the Chief of Staff had called an emergency meeting with his senior leadership team. The implications went far beyond a single downgraded award. If General Hayes was correct, and the evidence strongly suggested she was, then the military had systematically failed to properly recognize acts of exceptional courage and sacrifice. This was not just an administrative error, but a betrayal of the values that formed the foundation of military service. The meeting was tense and uncomfortable. Several senior officers expressed concern about the precedent that would be set by overturning award decisions, while others argued that failing to correct obvious injustices would be far more damaging to military morale and public confidence. The discussion continued for hours, with careful consideration given to both the immediate implications for affected soldiers and the broader impact on military culture. Meanwhile, Michael had finally decided to return to his duties at the training depot. The extended leave had helped him process his disappointment, and he felt ready to resume teaching young recruits the skills they would need to survive in combat. His colleagues welcomed him back warmly, though many were careful not to mention the award situation that everyone knew had caused his absence. On his first day back, Michael was assigned to work with a group of recruits who were preparing for deployment to various international missions. As he watched these young men and women practice tactical maneuvers and weapon handling, he was reminded of why military service mattered beyond any individual recognition or disappointment. These recruits were depending on him to prepare them properly, and their lives might one day depend on the lessons he taught them. During the lunch break, Michael received an unexpected phone call from Colonel Williams, his former commanding officer from Afghanistan. The colonel's voice was excited but carefully controlled as he explained that he had been contacted by senior headquarters about Michael's case. While he couldn't provide specific details, he strongly suggested that Michael should remain available for contact over the coming days. The conversation left Michael puzzled but cautiously hopeful. Colonel Williams was not the type of officer to raise false expectations, and his call suggested that something significant was happening behind the scenes. That evening, Michael shared the news with Sarah, who cautioned against getting their hopes up while privately allowing herself to imagine that justice might finally be served. Walter Henley had also received some interesting information through his network of contacts, though he remained characteristically discreet about what he had learned. During their evening tea, he seemed more cheerful than usual, and made several oblique comments about how patience and persistence often yielded unexpected results. Michael sensed that his elderly friend knew more than he was revealing, but Walter deflected direct questions with his usual gentle humor. Back at military headquarters, the administrative staff who had originally downgraded Michael's award were beginning to realize that their decisions were under intense scrutiny. Word of General Hayes's investigation had leaked through the informal communication networks that exist in any large organization, and the staff members found themselves fielding uncomfortable questions from colleagues and supervisors. The young clerk who had delivered the original downgrade decision to Michael was particularly anxious. He had simply followed the instructions given to him by his superiors, and had never questioned the appropriateness of reducing a Victoria Cross recommendation to a simple commendation. Now he was learning that his name was associated with a decision that senior officers considered a serious injustice. As the days passed, the pressure for a resolution continued to build. Veterans organizations had begun making discreet inquiries about military award procedures, prompted by rumors that deserving soldiers were being denied appropriate recognition. Several members of Parliament had received letters from constituents expressing concern about how heroes were being treated by the military establishment. The Chief of Staff found himself in an increasingly difficult position. The evidence presented by General Hayes was overwhelming and clearly demonstrated that multiple injustices had occurred. But reversing award decisions would require admitting that the military's administrative systems had failed, potentially undermining public confidence in the institution's judgment and competence. The solution came from an unexpected source. The military's legal department suggested that the downgraded awards could be restored through a special review process that emphasized new evidence and changed circumstances rather than administrative error. This approach would allow the military to correct the injustices without explicitly admitting that mistakes had been made in the original decisions. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. A special board of senior officers with combat experience would be established to review cases where new evidence or changed circumstances might justify upgrading previous award decisions. Michael's case would be among the first to be considered, along with several others that General Hayes had identified in her investigation. The announcement of this new review process was carefully crafted to emphasize the military's commitment to recognizing exceptional service while avoiding any suggestion that previous decisions had been inappropriate. The language was diplomatic and bureaucratically acceptable, but the practical effect would be to restore the Victoria Cross recommendations that had been unjustly downgraded. Michael learned about the new review process through the same junior clerk who had delivered the original downgrade decision. This time, however, the young man's demeanor was completely different. He was respectful and apologetic, explaining that Michael's case would be among the first to be reviewed by the new board, and that he should expect to hear results within a matter of weeks rather than months. As Michael left the headquarters building that day, he felt a mixture of cautious optimism and residual skepticism. He had been disappointed once by the military bureaucracy, and he was reluctant to invest too much emotional energy in what might turn out to be another administrative dead end. But something about the clerk's manner and Colonel Williams' earlier call suggested that this time might be different. The Special Review Board convened 3 weeks later in a conference room at military headquarters that had witnessed countless important decisions over the decades. The board consisted of 5 senior officers, all with extensive combat experience and distinguished service records. Their chairman was Brigadier James Morton, a veteran of multiple deployments who had personally recommended several Victoria Cross recipients during his career. Brigadier Morton had requested that the board review all available evidence before making their decision, including the original field reports, witness statements, medical records, and the controversial helmet camera footage that captured parts of Michael's heroic rescue operation. The board members spent hours studying the materials, asking detailed questions about combat conditions and military protocols. The evidence was overwhelming in its clarity. Michael had demonstrated extraordinary courage under fire, repeatedly exposing himself to enemy attack and life-threatening conditions to save the lives of his fellow soldiers. His actions clearly exceeded the normal expectations of duty and met every criterion established for the Victoria Cross. The board members found it difficult to understand how any military professional could have concluded otherwise when the administrative staff who had made the original downgrade decision were called to explain their reasoning. Their responses revealed a troubling lack of understanding about combat realities. They had applied bureaucratic criteria that might be appropriate for peacetime administrative tasks, but were completely inadequate for evaluating battlefield heroism. Their questions about whether Michael's actions exceeded normal expectations demonstrated a fundamental disconnect from military culture and values. The board's decision was unanimous and unequivocal. Michael Thompson's Victoria Cross recommendation should be immediately restored and processed for final approval. Furthermore, they recommended that the administrative committee responsible for the downgrade should be disbanded and replaced with a panel that included officers with actual combat experience. While the board was conducting its review, Michael continued his duties at the training depot, trying to maintain his focus on preparing young soldiers for deployment. But the anticipation was difficult to manage, and he found himself checking his phone constantly for messages that might provide some indication of the board's progress. Sarah noticed the tension in her husband's behavior and tried to provide emotional support while managing her own anxiety about the outcome. She had begun to allow herself to hope that justice might finally be served, but she also worried about how Michael would cope if he faced another disappointment from the military establishment. The children, Tommy and Emma, were aware that something important was happening but didn't fully understand the implications. Tommy had overheard conversations about medals and ceremonies, while Emma had noticed that her parents seemed nervous about something they weren't discussing openly. Both children tried to be especially well-behaved, sensing that their parents were dealing with adult concerns beyond their comprehension. Walter Henley had received word through his network that the review board had completed its work and that the results were favorable, but he remained characteristically discreet about sharing this information with Michael. Instead, he focused on providing steady friendship and support, maintaining their daily conversations over tea without raising expectations that might prove premature. The official notification came on a Thursday afternoon in late March. Michael was in the middle of a training exercise with his recruits when he received a call requesting his immediate presence at headquarters. The tone was formal but not unfriendly, giving no clear indication of whether the news would be positive or negative. As Michael drove to headquarters, his mind raced through various scenarios. He tried to prepare himself emotionally for another disappointment, while hoping that this time might be different. The journey that had taken him months earlier seemed much shorter now, though his heart was beating noticeably faster as he approached the familiar buildings. This time, however, he was escorted not to the sterile administrative office where he had received the downgrade decision, but to a more impressive conference room where Brigadier Morton was waiting with a warm smile and an outstretched hand. The difference in atmosphere was immediately apparent, and Michael felt a surge of cautious optimism as he took the offered seat. Brigadier Morton spoke with the directness that comes naturally to experienced military officers. The review board had completed its work and had unanimously concluded that Michael's Victoria Cross recommendation should be restored immediately. Furthermore, the case would be expedited through the remaining approval process to ensure that no additional delays occurred. The brigadier also apologized personally for the injustice that Michael had experienced, acknowledging that the military establishment had failed to properly recognize his extraordinary service. He explained the reforms that were being implemented to prevent similar situations from occurring in the future, emphasizing that Michael's case had prompted important changes in how military awards were evaluated. Michael felt a complex mixture of emotions as he absorbed this news. Relief was the strongest feeling, followed quickly by vindication and a renewed sense that his service and sacrifice had been properly valued. But there was also a lingering sadness about the months of disappointment and doubt that could have been avoided if the system had worked correctly from the beginning. The brigadier provided additional details about the next steps in the process. The final approval would come from the highest levels of government, but this was considered a formality, given the strength of the evidence and the board's unanimous recommendation. Michael could expect to receive official confirmation within 2 weeks, followed by scheduling for the ceremony at Buckingham Palace. As Michael left headquarters that afternoon, he felt as though a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The justice he had hoped for was finally within reach, and the recognition that his fellow soldiers deserved would soon be forthcoming. But perhaps more importantly, he had learned valuable lessons about persistence, patience, and the power of quiet advocacy that would serve him well in future challenges. The news of Michael's restored Victoria Cross recommendation spread quickly through the military community and eventually reached the attention of the royal household. Palace protocol officers began making preliminary arrangements for what they expected would be a routine investiture ceremony, similar to dozens of others conducted each year for various military and civilian honors. However, something unusual happened during the planning process. King Charles himself requested to review the details of Michael's case, having heard about the circumstances that led to the original downgrade and subsequent restoration. As he read through the files, including the dramatic accounts of the rescue operation in Afghanistan, the king became personally interested in ensuring that this particular ceremony would be conducted with special attention to its significance. Palace staff were surprised when King Charles suggested that he might visit Michael personally before the formal ceremony, rather than waiting for the traditional Buckingham Palace investiture. This was highly unusual protocol, but the king felt that the injustice Michael had experienced warranted an exceptional response that would demonstrate the crown's commitment to honoring genuine heroism. Meanwhile, Michael was dealing with a whirlwind of emotions and practical arrangements. Sarah had immediately called their families to share the good news, and messages of congratulation poured in from friends, colleagues, and fellow veterans who had followed his story with interest. The children were excited about the prospect of visiting Buckingham Palace, though they still didn't fully comprehend the significance of their father's award. Walter Henley was quietly pleased that his patient advocacy had contributed to this positive outcome, though he characteristically deflected Michael's attempts to thank him for his support. During their tea conversations, he focused instead on helping Michael prepare mentally for the recognition and attention that would accompany his Victoria Cross, knowing that some heroes found public acknowledgement more challenging than private courage. The official confirmation arrived on a Monday morning in early April, delivered by a formally dressed military aide who presented Michael with an ornate envelope bearing official seals and signatures. The letter confirmed his Victoria Cross award and provided initial details about the ceremony, though it mentioned that additional information would follow regarding scheduling and protocol. What the letter didn't mention was the unusual level of interest that the case had generated within the royal household. Palace staff were working discreetly to arrange King Charles's proposed personal visit, coordinating with military security and protocol officers to ensure that such an unprecedented event could be conducted safely and appropriately. Michael returned to his duties at the training depot with renewed energy and purpose. The young recruits he was training seemed to sense that something significant had changed in their instructor's demeanor. He was more confident, more authoritative, and more passionate about preparing them for the realities they would face in operational deployments. During one particularly intense training exercise, Michael found himself sharing stories about Afghanistan with his recruits, describing the importance of unit cohesion and mutual support in combat situations. He spoke about the rescue operation that had earned him the Victoria Cross, not to boast about his own actions, but to illustrate the principles of military service that went beyond individual heroism. The recruits listened with rapt attention as Michael explained how courage in combat wasn't about the absence of fear, but about acting decisively, despite fear when the lives of fellow soldiers were at stake. He emphasized that anyone in that burning convoy would have done the same thing if they had been physically capable, because that's what military service demanded of people who truly understood its meaning. Sarah noticed a fundamental change in her husband's outlook and behavior. The bitterness and disappointment that had clouded his personality for months had been replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and pride in his military service. He spoke more frequently about his career, made plans for continuing his role in training new soldiers, and seemed to have rediscovered his natural optimism about life. The children also benefited from their father's improved mood. Tommy began asking more questions about military service, and expressing interest in possibly following a similar career path when he grew older. Emma enjoyed her father's increased availability for games and bedtime stories, though she still didn't understand why everyone seemed so excited about a medal. As April progressed, Michael began receiving additional communications from military headquarters about ceremony preparations. He was assigned a liaison officer to help coordinate arrangements for his family's attendance and to brief him on the protocol he would be expected to follow during the investiture. These preparations felt surreal after months of disappointment, but they also provided tangible evidence that his recognition was finally becoming reality. What Michael didn't know was that plans were being made for something far more extraordinary than a standard ceremony. King Charles had finalized his decision to visit Michael personally, and palace staff were working with military coordinators to arrange this unprecedented event. The visit would take place before the formal investiture, serving as both a personal gesture of respect and a public demonstration of the Crown's commitment to honoring military service. The arrangements were complex and required careful coordination between multiple security agencies, protocol officers, and local authorities. The visit would need to appear spontaneous and informal, while actually being meticulously planned to ensure the safety of all involved. Media coverage would be limited but strategically managed to convey the appropriate message about honoring military heroes. As the end of April approached, Michael remained focused on his daily responsibilities, unaware that his story was about to take another dramatic turn that would exceed even his restored expectations about recognition and justice. On a beautiful spring morning in early May, Michael was working in his garden when Sarah called out from the kitchen window that there were several black cars pulling into their driveway. Michael wiped the soil from his hands and walked toward the front of the house, assuming that military officials had arrived to discuss final ceremony arrangements. What he saw instead was a scene that seemed impossible to believe. The lead vehicle bore the royal standard, and as he watched in stunned amazement, King Charles emerged from the car, accompanied by a small retinue of officials and security personnel. The king was dressed informally but elegantly, and he approached Michael with a warm smile and an outstretched hand. Michael's military training took over, and he instinctively straightened to attention before offering a respectful bow. But King Charles immediately put him at ease, explaining that this was an informal visit to personally thank Michael for his extraordinary service and to apologize for the administrative failures that had delayed his proper recognition. Sarah appeared at the front door, having quickly changed from her gardening clothes into something more presentable, though she was still processing the surreal reality of having the king standing in their front garden. Tommy and Emma peered out from behind their mother, wide-eyed with excitement and uncertainty about how to behave in such an unprecedented situation. King Charles spoke with genuine warmth and knowledge about Michael's service record, demonstrating that he had taken time to thoroughly understand the details of the Afghanistan rescue operation and the subsequent bureaucratic mishandling of his award. The king expressed particular admiration for Michael's persistence in continuing his military duties, despite the disappointment he had experienced. The conversation moved naturally from formal acknowledgments to more personal topics. King Charles asked about Michael's family, his current work training new recruits, and his plans for the future. He also inquired about the impact that the award controversy had on Michael's well-being, listening attentively to honest answers about the emotional challenges of feeling undervalued by the institution he had served faithfully. Walter Henley, hearing the commotion from his nearby cottage, appeared at his garden gate and was invited to join the conversation. King Charles was delighted to meet the elderly veteran whose quiet advocacy had played such an important role in bringing Michael's case to proper attention. Walter handled the situation with characteristic grace, deflecting credit while emphasizing the importance of supporting fellow veterans through difficult circumstances. The king spent nearly an hour with Michael's family, displaying the kind of genuine interest and personal warmth that transformed what could have been a formal obligation into a meaningful human connection. He played briefly with Tommy and Emma, asking them about school and their interests, and complimented Sarah on the beautiful garden that surrounded their cottage. As the visit drew to a close, King Charles presented Michael with a preliminary version of his Victoria Cross, explaining that the formal ceremony would still take place at Buckingham Palace, but that he wanted Michael to have this tangible recognition immediately. The medal was accompanied by a personal letter from the king, acknowledging both Michael's heroism and the injustice he had endured. The king also announced that he was personally directing a comprehensive review of military award procedures to ensure that similar administrative failures could not occur in the future. Michael's case would serve as a catalyst for reforms that would protect other deserving soldiers from experiencing comparable disappointments. After the royal entourage departed, Michael's family stood in their front garden trying to process what had just occurred. Neighbors began emerging from their homes, having noticed the unusual activity, and word spread quickly through the village that the king had paid a personal visit to honor a local war hero. The formal ceremony at Buckingham Palace took place 3 weeks later, attended by Michael's extended family, military colleagues, and several of the soldiers he had rescued in Afghanistan. The event received significant media coverage, not only because of the Victoria Cross presentation, but because of the unusual personal visit that had preceded it. During his remarks at the ceremony, King Charles referenced Michael's case as an example of the importance of ensuring that genuine heroism receives proper recognition, regardless of administrative obstacles. He emphasized that the Crown's commitment to honoring military service transcended bureaucratic procedures and would always prioritize substance over process. Michael's story became a touchstone for military award reform, leading to the establishment of new procedures that included combat veterans in all award evaluation committees. The administrative staff who had originally downgraded his recommendation were quietly reassigned to other duties, while General Hayes received recognition for her thorough investigation and reform recommendations. In the months that followed, Michael continued his work training new recruits with renewed purpose and authority. His Victoria Cross became a teaching tool that he used to illustrate the values and principles that defined military service at its highest level. Young soldiers found inspiration in his story, not only for the heroism he had displayed in Afghanistan, but for the dignity and persistence he had shown in the face of institutional disappointment. Walter Henley remained a close friend and mentor, though he never sought recognition for his role in bringing Michael's case to proper attention. Their daily tea conversations continued, ranging across topics of military history, gardening, philosophy, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from seeing justice finally served through patient advocacy and principled action. Michael's family adapted to their new circumstances with characteristic resilience and humor. Sarah returned to her teaching with renewed appreciation for her husband's service, while Tommy and Emma gradually understood that their father's medal represented something truly extraordinary that would be remembered for generations to come. The cottage in Wiltshire remained their home, but it had also become a symbol of how ordinary people could overcome institutional injustice through courage, persistence, and the support of friends who understood that some causes were worth fighting, for even when the fight required patience, discretion, and faith, that justice would ultimately prevail.